Why hello there, and welcome to, I guess let's call it a Let's Make Us a Character Special Edition. 2 years ago, I made what is widely regarded as the most comprehensive look at the most infamous role-playing game ever created, Fatal, From Another Time, Another Land, or Fantasy Adventure to Adult Lechery, a game whose general existence and backstory I am not going to bother explaining here because if you clicked on this very specific video, I must assume that you already have a basic idea of what Fatal is and have likely seen at least some of the hours of content I have already made attempting to interpret and explain the rules in a vaguely coherent manner. But even with all of the coverage I have done on this, I guess we'll call it a game, there is one important thing that I did just kind of gloss over for reasons. Yes, I am of course talking about the sex rules, because as an edgy piece of shit designed by and for edgy pieces of shit, nothing is as essential as sex rules to shock any granny. And this is a topic that I tried to avoid as much as I could in the original video series because YouTube, and specifically advertisers on YouTube, do not like it when you talk about sex in any way other than condemnationally. And yes, that includes educationally, which arguably these videos are. Which is why this video is sponsored by Dinosaur Erotica, the role-playing game. A game of bizarre romance for 2 players, or more if that's what you're into. An intimate duet role-playing experience that lets you leave your expectations behind and jump headfirst into the erotic world of dinosaur accountants, Mothman rock stars, and ghost pirate helicopters. Available now, link in description. A real game, but one made by me, so not a real sponsorship, I have to specify, once again for YouTube reasons. And before I get into it, I must once again provide a bit of a disclaimer here, because I know how people tend to react to this kind of content. In this video, I am going to be talking about penises and vaginas and penetration and ejaculation and all kinds of things like that. And while the context in which I am discussing these things could conservatively be referred to as abnormal, those things themselves are completely normal and should not in any way be taboo to talk about. I see a lot of people, specifically on the topic of Fatal, having a very ew sex attitude and listing the fact that it has sex rules as one of the biggest issues with the game. And the fact that there are sex rules isn't the issue. The issue is that those sex rules are weird and creepy and not in a fun way. Sex in media is not in itself bad, and equating inclusion of sexual content to proof of immorality does nothing but support all of the people who are currently working very hard to ban even the most vaguely sexual content from every platform, which will eventually include the stuff that you like. So with that out of the way, I guess it's time to subject Parmy to even more indignities and look at the least sexy rules for sex, or fatal fucking. So in part 4, Parmy, an enslaved kobold chambermaid, because as a kobold you have a 60% chance of your character being a slave, ran into a goblin while cleaning under the bed. And at the time, I used that as an opportunity to explain combat. But what if they had resolved things a little differently? Is a thing that would be a hilarious framing for this example, but unfortunately, in the author's dedication to making the most difficult, detailed, realistic, and historically/mythologically accurate role-playing game available, he also kind of just didn't bother providing sexual feature adjustments for anything outside of the player races, who, as you may remember from the previous videos, are all unplayable other than humans. So while child-eating ogres and trolls that turn into stone in sunlight were considered important enough to get all their diameters, lengths, depths, and circumferences, goblins were not. Although, admittedly, for a man-hooded partner, as I will need for this discussion, technically all you need is height or length, which would work for a goblin because they do have average height provided, but also using a 2-foot-tall partner would skew the numbers in a way that, while hilarious, would not accurately represent the intended use of the rules, and I don't need to try to make this game look bad. That work was already done for me. So we will need a partner, and as hilarious as it would be to set Parmy up with an ogre, troll, anakim, or bugbear, especially since that would give me an excuse to mention the fact that bugbear are specified to have 1-inch long hairs growing out the head of their penis, I mean manhood, a thing you are now desperately trying not to picture, I will not be doing that because while it would accurately reflect the intended use of the rules, it would specifically involve rules that I just don't want to deal with because they are both incredibly uncomfortable and uselessly incomplete. Because despite what people say, there aren't actually rules for determining how much damage is taken for exceeding the circumference potential, just the implication that those rules exist. And going with a kobold or human would be a bit too much what they want us to do, so let's pair her up with, I don't know, an elf. But don't worry, we don't have to roll up a whole second character because Fatal provides 10 Edile characters for each race category. Oh, except elves, I guess. Like, seriously, it is nearly impossible to do anything in this game without encountering something that the designer just apparently didn't feel like doing. A weird amount of which involves elves. Okay, so I guess a dwarf then, and this level 6 brickmaker is as good as any other option. So that saves us a good hour or so of rolling, but also does fail to provide some necessary details, which means it is time to revisit some of the worst content in Fatal. In Chapter 2, Body. So a male dwarf has a height of 66 plus 27 inches, so 45 inches or 3 foot 9, which is 3 inches below the average height for a male dwarf, and 7 inches shorter than Parmy. I don't know, maybe she's into short kings. And that results in minus 12 pounds to weight and minus 9 to strength and bodily attractiveness. And this is particularly noteworthy because it is the only time that Fatal holds men to a beauty standard to which it does not hold women. And I would of course be remiss if I did not point out that obsession over men's height as a metric of attractiveness is one of the major pillars of incel philosophy. Then weight, which is 4d10 plus 78 pounds, minus the 12 pounds from earlier for 85 pounds, which is 15 pounds under the average for a male dwarf, which is another minus 3 to strength. Yes, if you are below average height, you take a penalty to strength and weight, which makes you more likely to be below average weight and take another penalty to strength. Then we need to determine BMI because that is just the kind of game Fatal is, which is equal to weight divided by the square of height multiplied by 705. So 29.59, which is within the normal BMI range for a male dwarf, meaning no penalties to bodily attractiveness for being over or underweight. And I should probably roll up an age too, because that is the thing that can have a big impact on attributes. Also, I just want to roll a D1000 because it's silly. And 636, which makes this character venerable, resulting in a 90% penalty to bodily attractiveness, 65% penalty to facial charisma, and 60% penalty to kinetic charisma, which are the relevant sex stats. So we're just going to ignore that and just say this character is a young adult because I don't really want to deal with all the age modifiers. Honestly, I really only brought it up to once again point out that a venerable dwarf is any over 200 years old, and the dwarven starting age is rolled on a D1000, meaning that 80% of dwarf characters rolled will be venerable and take those huge penalties to every attribute. A thing that I want to call the biggest oversight in character creation, but it's fucking fatal and there is no shortage of competition for that title. Also, it is just as likely that this was an intentional design decision to make dwarves less viable as player characters. So let's just skip ahead to the sexual features, because that is what this video is about. And areola and nipple dimensions do not provide any adjustment for male characters, so we'll just skip those. And technically it doesn't say to only roll up cup size for female characters. However, just like it also doesn't specify which genitals to roll for which gender, I am going to make an assumption here based on what I believe to be the intentions of the author, and I believe those intentions to be very cis-heteronormative. Then tongue size doesn't really affect anything, and we are not going to be getting kinky enough to need any anal depth circumference or potential. Which brings us to the most important part of the character, at least according to Byron Hall. The manhood. As mentioned in the other videos, there is something of a weird obsession here with, I guess we can call it the poetic magistry of the manhood. Right down to not only using that stupid term exclusively, but also capitalizing it. Like, as much of this game just seems to be an afterthought, that is a very intentional choice that has been made and actually implemented throughout the entire book. And there is, of course, the temptation to say that he is just obsessed with dicks, but I know people who are obsessed with dicks, and they are not even close to this weird about it. This is obsession with the idea of the penis as a symbol of masculine power, not as something desired or even desirable, but rather revered. Which is why manhood is given this whole-ass description and vaginae are only given measurements. Like, seriously, just try to imagine the mental state you would have to be in to feel that it was necessary to define chode in your role-playing game. That is the mind behind Fatal. But manhood is also given measurements, and that is a thing we need to deal with. So, length is simply equal to a base length of a number of inches equal to height in feet. So 3'9" is 3.75 feet and 3.75 inches. Then we roll 10d100 divided by 5 minus 1, which you may recall is a thing that you have to do 20 times to determine your sub-abilities. And once again is only used as a reference number on a table, meaning that the -1 only exists because Byron Hall was either unable to comprehend a table starting at 2, or made all of the tables starting at 1 without realizing that you could not roll a 1 on 4d100 divided by 2, which is what was used in earlier versions. And then made the change that required the least amount of effort, as is the way of Fatal. Either way, at 123, which is plus 33%, and 133% of 3.75 is a final length of 4.99 inches, which I'll just tell you now, does not factor in here mechanically at all. Then circumference, which is the same base multiplied by 0.85, so 3.19. Then roll that 10d100 divided by 5 minus 1 again, and 112.2 is plus 16% for a final circumference of 3.7 inches. So now we have a dwarven manhood length and circumference, but all other details are left to the Edile. Yes, in addition to everything else, Fatal specifically gives the GM the authority and responsibility of deciding in which direction and how severely your character's dick curves. Which, incidentally, would be a pretty good name for a Fatal character if you were allowed to choose your own character name. So as mentioned earlier, the only thing that actually affects the size of a character's manhood is their height, and a roll to apply a stupid modifier, quote, solved with a polynomial using quadratic regression based on what Fatal Games believes to be the smallest and largest manhood relative to height. Which is probably one of the most honest things in this book. determined with unnecessarily complex math that makes me feel smart, based on some values I just kinda made up. Which also means that despite apparently being well known for their manhood, Anakim are proportionally no more or less well endowed than a human, dwarf, or presumably goblin. And just because it's going to be important later, I do need to remind you that vaginal and anal circumference potential is not just affected by, but entirely defined by the character's race, with individual height having no impact. In fact, even average racial height has very little impact, since Anakim, bugbear, and trolls, and dwarves, elves, humans, and kobolds share sets of circumferences, despite the fact that both of those groups have a range in average height of over a foot. But as I said, that is a thing that is going to come up later, so for now, those are all the stats we need to actually start explaining this whole unfortunate situation. But to do that, we first need to convince this dwarf to sex with us, using the art of seduction. Which means using the seduction skill, mainly for a brief overview of how normal skills work in Fatal. So skill checks in Fatal, or this version of Fatal, are rolled with 3d10 to which one or the average of multiple ability or sub-ability modifiers are added. In this case, Charisma and Bodily Attractiveness, both of which are -3 for Parmy. So we roll 3d10 and subtract 3, as well as adding our points invested in the seduction skill, which is none. And then, since it is easier to seduce those less attractive, the difference between charisma ability scores of the seducer and subject are adjusted. I gotta admit, sometimes pointing out just how closely this game follows basic incel philosophy feels too easy, but also too obvious not to mention. So we have charisma of 92, and the dwarf, let's just call him Bob, charisma of 100. Yeah, he's got a lot of rhetorical charisma, so quite the smooth talker, that Bob McDwarfman. So that is a difference of 8 in Bob's favor, which translates to a -2 penalty. Then the E-dial determines a racial and or cultural antipathy modifier ranging from -20 to 0. I'm sorry, did you think racism wouldn't be factored into this? And I could pull out the racial hatred table and roll some dice, but honestly, that would almost certainly result in a -20 penalty, so I don't know, let's just say -4. I mean, it's not like any of the numbers that the book actually provides have any meaning either. Then another adjustment if the target has been drinking, ranging from +1 to +8, and I don't know, let's just say that Bob's got a good buzz going on from a couple of dwarven ales, so +1. And finally, a personal adjustment set by the E-dial ranging from -10, man-hating virgin, to +10, in heat. Because, of course, those are the examples provided. At this point, none of this stuff is surprising, even in the least. It would be more surprising if something was even vaguely normal. And, I don't know, let's just say it's +5 because Bob's a real big boob man, and Parmy has a rockin' set of knockers, which you may recall was rolled as her most attractive trait in the previous video. So after all of that, back to an overall modifier of -3, versus a target, or threshold as they are known, of 25. Or 20 for females. And of course we succeed, meaning Bob the dwarf is now willing to mate, because we kind of had to move on to what you actually came here for, the stupid 3-page sexual adeptness skill. But before we actually get anything into anything else, I do need to talk about investing skill points into sexual adeptness, because obviously it starts being complicated before you even roll. So each point invested into the skill gives you 1 sexual adeptness point, a thing that is presented and given an official abbreviation as if it is an important game term that will come up over and over again, despite never coming up again. And each point is then invested in a specialty, cunnilingus, ejaculation/orgasm control, fellatio, or positions, all of which I will unfortunately have to talk about later, but for now let's just say that Parmy did invest 5 points in this skill, putting 2 sexual adeptness points into positions and 3 into orgasm control. Also, I have now used that term more times than the book does. And with that settled, now we can do a sex. Which as a skill check is done by rolling a 3d10 and adding the average of all relevant of bodily attractiveness modifier, except in darkness, so -3, facial charisma modifier, except in darkness or with a sack overhead, -34, kinetic charisma modifier, except in darkness, +27, skill points invested in the contortion skill, depending on position and only if debauchery exceeds 50, and don't have any of those, skill points invested in the sexual adeptness skill, so 5, skill points invested in the most appropriate specialty, and let's just say we are using our 2 points in positions, and tightness, which we now have to calculate. So to calculate tightness, we must first determine the base tightness by dividing manhood circumference by vaginal circumference potential and multiplying by 100. So Bob's manhoodal circumference is 3.7 inches, and Parmy's vaginal circumference potential is 4 to 5 inches. Well, that's an issue, isn't it? Yeah, a big part of the reason why I made sure to draw attention to the difference in calculating circumferences is that whole circumference is not given in specific measurements, just ranges, that at the high end can be as much as 9 inches, so dang, I guess I can't do this after all. Yeah, okay, I will once again fix Byron's work just so that I can continue subjecting myself and you, the viewer, to the horrors of Fatal. And I don't know, I guess I'll just roll a d hundredths and 0.87, so 4.87 inches of vaginal circumference potential. And 3.7 divided by 4.87 times 100 is, let's just round to 76. And then we have to solve for y. Are you regretting your decision to watch this video yet? Because honestly, I am starting to regret making it. So base tightness of 76 minus 80 squared equals -4y plus 120. 76 minus 80 is -4 squared equals -4y plus 120. -4 squared is 16 equals -4y plus 120, then subtract 120 from both sides for -104 equals -4y, and divide both sides by -4 for 26 equals y, or y equals 26, the order does not matter. And while it is hilarious to say that Fatal is so stupidly complicated that you need to solve for y to determine a tightness modifier, the fact is you don't actually have to solve for y because, once again, as I can only assume is the closest thing to a design philosophy behind this game, it is just another case of doing something in the most complicated way for no discernible reason other than wanting the rules to seem more advanced. Like, yeah, you have to solve for y to determine the tightness modifier during sex in my game. You D&D babies could never handle that. The funny thing is, you don't have to solve for y here. This could easily be a basic formula. Base tightness minus 80 squared minus 120 divided by -4. But I guess 3 sets of parentheses was just too complicated for Mr. Statistics to figure out. Also, the results here are kinda interesting because you actually hit the maximum tightness bonus at an 80% base tightness, which then goes down in either direction from there. And I can make a sassy comment about that, but you're probably already thinking it, and also, we need to revisit the circumference potential generation rules, because I mentioned how it groups together races with radically different heights into a single set of values, which might just seem lazy, but also might have a more interesting explanation. So in the world of Fatal, the average human man's hood would have a circumference of 4.96 inches. And let's just say that the average human womanhood circumference potential is 6 inches, the border between the two central values. That gives an average base tightness of 82 and a tightness modifier of 29. About as close as you can get to that perfect value while also keeping those base values fairly neat. But that also means that the average dwarf, elf, and kobold hole are also perfectly sized for human manhood, since they share the same values on the table. But at 4 foot even, the average dwarf hood has a circumference of 3.4 inches, and since dwarves share circumference potential with humans, that would then be an average base tightness of 56, which is a minus 114 tightness modifier. And if we wanted to be very generous with the rules here, we could set the circumference potential to the minimum average size of 5 inches, making it a minus 6 modifier. Which is why I made such a big deal about there being over a foot difference in average height between races with the same circumferences, because a single inch here can reasonably change a modifier by over 100. So when I said it would be humorous but not accurately reflect the rules to use a goblin, that's because at 2 feet tall and an average circumference of 1.7 inches, we would be dealing with a base tightness of 34, translating to an overall modifier of minus 499. And this might seem kinda weird to you if you are still trying to think of Fatal as a normal game, one where the rules in some meaningful way reflect the vision of the game's creator. But it is not. And the big thing here that people who talk about Fatal somewhat intentionally overlook for comedic value, myself included, is that regardless of anything, or rather everything in the rules, this game is 100% intended to only be played with human male player characters. Yes, technically, you can play as something other than a human man. There are rules for that, lots of them, but also it clearly tries to dissuade you from doing so, both by making those rules awful and also just flat out telling you that you shouldn't. It doesn't want you to use those options, but more importantly, wants you to think you made that decision yourself. And once you realize that the rules for female and non-human characters were never actually meant to be used for player characters, a lot of things start making way more sense. Elven vaginas are not for elven penises. They are exotic luxuries for human men to take and use as they see fit, and as such are ideally sized for a human partner, rather than an elf. And there is so much more to say on this topic, but the deeper I go, the further off topic it gets, so let's just get back to the weird sex rules that exist for some reason. So now we add our tightness modifier of 26 for a total modifier of 3.833, etc., rounded to 3. But now, I do need to talk about the specialties. And basically the relevant 3 for now are cunnilingus, fellatio, and positions. And this is where you might start wondering if I am actually just making shit up, because honestly, I'm not even sure that I believe me at this point. Cunnilingus provides no specific bonuses other than points invested and presumably removing tightness from the equation, which is good if you have a minus 499 tightness modifier, and presumably the same with fellatio, except it also is specified to make bodily attractiveness count half as much as facial charisma. And positions lets you learn new exciting positions like doggy style, which is specified to make facial charisma count half as much as bodily attractiveness. And yes, I guess with no ranks in positions, you only know one sex position, because, as we all know, historically speaking, the average medieval European would only have known one sex position, and it was definitely missionary. Or maybe I am just confusing real historical Europe with the fantasy pure European culture free from degenerate outside influences of Fatal. And let's just say that we are in fact using the forbidden exotic doggy style, which, as mentioned, was of course not a basic thing that good moral people knew about in medieval Europe. Meaning that facial charisma will count only half as much as bodily attractiveness. And how do we factor that in? Excellent question, and like so many other things, it is not explained because, honestly, he probably never bothered figuring it out himself. It just seemed like a cool, edgy thing to say. But I do need to figure that out to finish this explanation, so I am going to pre-average facial charisma and 2 bodily attractivenesses, and then average all of the numbers, treating that pre-averaged value as 2 values. Because that is the closest thing to something that makes sense for a total of plus 7.77 whatever, rounded to 7. And then we have to do all of that for Bob too, except that the tightness modifier is going to be the same because it's the same peg in the same hole, and an overall modifier of minus 0.25 rounded to plus 0. But before we roll, there's actually a secret 8th thing. The debauchery discrepancy penalty, which accounts for discrepancy in the character's debauchery scores. So, Parmy has a debauchery of 93, and Bob, I guess I need to roll, so 35 minus 10 for being a dwarf is 25, willing to give fingering. That absolute depraved lunatic. But as previously mentioned, he is also buzzed, granting a plus 1d10 debauchery bonus, so 28. Will give oral sex. Scandalous. And then to calculate the penalty, we subtract one score from the other, squaring presumably, as that is what the formula says, even though the text does not, and dividing by 100. So 93 minus 28 is 65, 65 squared is 4,225, and 4,225 divided by 100 is 42.25, which is applied as a penalty to the roll. So now, with all of the modifiers calculated, we can finally roll, and negative 12 and negative 22. Unsurprisingly, 2 results of dysfunctional. Yeah, that debauchery discrepancy penalty can be a little extreme and is definitely something that would only be made by someone with no weird hang-ups about sex. But despite everything and how poorly it turned out, we did finally roll for sex, so that's something. And at this point, you might be thinking, wow, in what sad and absurd version of reality would you ever actually want or need to do that? And unfortunately, these rules do technically have a function in-game. You see, for each successfully assisted ejaculation or orgasm, a whore acquires a number of AP equal to the adjusted number of her sexual adeptness check, which hilariously makes whores one of the fastest advancing occupations in Fatal. Well, at least during those first few levels where advancing via those occupational rewards is even close to reasonable. And unfortunately, as you can tell by looking at the remaining runtime, I'm only like half through explaining the sexual adeptness skill and other related things, so there is a lot left to cover here, which I will tell you right now is worse than what I've already gone over. So first, I suppose we should probably roll versus Parmy's Hymen Resistance, which I actually did roll in the previous video and is 49. So Bob rolls a D100 and adds the base tightness value for 80 plus 76 equals 156, which does just barely surpass 49. And notably, the rules here do not actually tell you to use base tightness just to do the same calculation, because this is Fatal, and these rules and those for the sexual adeptness skill are in different chapters of the book, which, in terms of consistency, might as well be different books for different editions of different games. But moving back to the sexual adeptness skill, up next is Ejaculation/Orgasm Control, which, as mentioned, is a specialty into which sexual adeptness points can be put, and is one specialty that covers 2 different things depending on if your character has an innie or an outie. For female characters, it is used in determining the likeliness of orgasming during the sexual encounter, using the character's base orgasm odds, or BOO, Another term that is introduced and given an abbreviation despite coming up once more in the next sentence, and I'm pretty sure I did not roll for that in the previous videos because it would mean cracking the seal on this particular can of worms, so D163. Then we subtract the base orgasm odds and sexual adeptness points invested in orgasm control from 100 to get the unnamed threshold value for orgasm, which is 34, which then presumably must be hit by the partner's sexual adeptness roll to initiate orgasming. It doesn't actually specify that though. Which remember is a 3d10 roll to hit a value with a base range from 0 to 99. And just a reminder, a result of 30 or higher is considered godlike. 70% of female characters in Fatal require a godlike sexual performance to get off. And I feel like I'm shooting fish tied to a chair at point blank range with this one, but just because you have never seen a woman orgasm doesn't make it some mythical feat only achievable by extreme luck and or godlike skill. But moving on, the calculations for determining if a male character orgasms, or rather ejaculates because I guess orgasms are just for girls, don't exist. It just happens regardless because of course it does. And if you are thinking that that is going to make the ejaculation control rules easier, you are wrong. Very wrong. What the ejaculation control rules do cover is ability to delay ejaculation. But for how long? Excellent question that I, unfortunately, almost have an answer for. For each sexual adeptness point invested in ejaculation control, you can add 60 seconds to the base time of 300 seconds, if desired. But of course it's not even close to that simple. And to determine the actual, let's just call it ejaculation control time, we must first determine scrotum emptiness. And I do not blame anyone who just clicked off the video right now. Which is equal to 100 minus scrotum fullness, and I will have to explain that later, so for now let's just say 100 minus 75 equals 25. Which is then divided by 100 and multiplied by the base ejaculation control time, so 75. Then we must consider the partner's bodily attractiveness and facial charisma skill modifiers, so we use the same 2-to-1 value as earlier, except that now, since there are only 2 values, it actually makes sense, and we already calculated that that is minus 13, which we add the opposite of, so plus 13 for 88. Then, if the sexual stimulus is novel, multiply by 0.2, and if not novel, but boring, multiply by 2. And let's just say that this is Bob's first time with a hot kobold chambermaid, so times 0.2. And then there are some age-based modifiers that do not apply here because I specifically avoided using them, so a total ejaculation control time of 17.6 seconds. And what does that mean exactly? I do not know. I did all of the maths provided, and that is the number that the rules spit out. All it gives you is that base time, those calculations that I just went through, and then ends. It never says if that calculated time is total duration, or if that duration is supposed to be added back to the base, or a secret third thing that never made its way onto the page. But working off of what I have and a general rule to always go with whatever seems to break the rules the least, I am going to say that it is added back to the base time for a total of 317.6 seconds. Because if your scrotum emptiness is 0, which is not unlikely, you can very easily end up with a result that is 0 or negative, a possibility that the later novelness adjustments do not take into consideration. And if you're wondering if this duration then in some way affects your sexual adeptness roll, of course not. I already covered that in its entirety. These rules do not affect anything that even hypothetically matters in any way. And speaking of overly complicated ejaculation rules that have no meaningful impact on or function in the game, the second set of ejaculation rules, which are probably the most useless rules I have ever seen in any game. And as mentioned earlier, we first need to determine scrotum fullness. So, every ejaculation empties a percentage of accumulated sperm based on age, which for a young adult is 50%. And that is 50% of current fullness, not total. So if Bob ejaculated twice in one day starting from full, that would be minus 50% for the first one, then minus 25% for the next, 50% of the remaining 50%. Sperm then reaccumulates at a set percentage of total per day. So once again, as a young adult, it would take 2 days to fill from totally drained, or 50% per day, which is the much easier way to say that. So after coming down to 25% and then waiting a day, Bob would be back up to 75%, the initial 25% plus daily accumulation of 50%. And with that sorted, we must now determine the number of ejaculatory contractions, which is equal to 4 plus 1d6, so 6. And finally, ejaculatory distance, which has a base equal to breadth, which for a dwarf is 60% of height, so 27 inches, with age penalties that, as I stated, I don't care enough to deal with. Which is then multiplied by physical fitness divided by 100, so 21.33, as well as bodily attractiveness or facial charisma of a real or imagined partner. It is specified that this can be based on someone they are imagining. So let's say body because of the rack for 20.4768. Then, just like ejaculation control, we need to consider the novelty of the sexual stimuli, reducing the ED by 1d10% if this is not their first time with that partner, and another 1d10% if it is not their first time in that position. And we previously established this is the first time that Bob has been exposed to the deviant sex arrangements of someone who knows 3 positions, so no adjustment here. And then finally, we multiply by scrotum fullness divided by 100 for a total ejaculatory distance of 15.3576 inches. But of course, that is only for the first contraction, with each successive contraction spurting only 1d100% as far. And if you are wondering why you would ever need any ejaculation distance, let alone a specific distance for each spurt, yeah, me too. Like, even with something like the ejaculate acid spell, that information is just simply not necessary. It is just another long, drawn-out set of rules that do nothing but take up space in the book and exist as a thing that you can say you have rules for. And there is still one last bit to the sexual adeptness skill, which is another one for the ladies. Vaginal Soreness. And that is equal to base tightness, this is the second and last use of that, multiplied by the duration of vaginal penetration in minutes. And 317.6 seconds is 5.29 minutes. Also, if anyone ever asks you if you can name a role-playing game that uses the phrase duration of vaginal penetration, now you can. Then that is multiplied by 0.003 for 1.2, which is the duration of vaginal soreness in hours. And that is what makes the ejaculation control rules just slightly less useless than the ejaculation distance rules. You do actually need that duration to calculate another useless value. And that is it for the sexual adeptness skill, but, sex isn't all circumferences, durations, and distances. There is, of course, the ever-present threat of baby making. Which, of course, is another thing you roll for in Fatal. So first, you roll a D100 to check sperm count. Yes, really, with any result above 20 being a sufficient count, and then roll again for the actual impregnation roll, which only succeeds on a 1. But if the roll had succeeded, and also these characters were of the same race, because I'm sure this game is not intended to have that be a possibility, we would then need to roll a D10 million to determine offspring number, and then to determine the stats for those offspring, average the stats of the parents, and adjust by some stupid nonsense. And those were the sex rules in Fatal. Well, the consensual sex rules, which are bad enough on their own, but this is a video on sex in Fatal, so I would be remiss if I did not talk about the rules for sexual assault. And I could go on about all of the bullshit claims of historical accuracy, the number of magical and non-magical effects that compel a character to commit sexual assault, or even the insistence on using the historical name for turnips. You know, for historical accuracy, not just to be edgy, despite not doing the same for anything else. But at this point, I don't think anyone actually needs convincing that this game was written by someone who, at best, thinks sexual assault is funny. And how does such a person address such a sensitive issue? Well, as casually as possible, of course. Basically making it nothing more than a use of the intimidation and/or wrestling skill. And I just had to explain the rules for calculating ejaculatory distance, so this is where I'm drawing the line. But I would just like to point out the language in the wrestling skill, which starts, if a human male successfully overbears a female, which really supports my assertion that human males are the only thing you are supposed to be playing as. Or at the very least are supposed to be the only ones with the ability to wield sexual violence. But now it is the part of the video where I actually have to try to analyze and discuss these rules as if they were in any way real rules that had any meaningful function in a game. And the very easy accusation and joke to make here is that these are rules for sex that feel like they were written by someone who's never actually had sex. But if you look at it from a more sex-positive perspective, which is my default lens, it seems much more like rules for sex written by someone who's never enjoyed sex, and fundamentally does not understand sex as a thing to be enjoyed. At least from the phallocentric perspective that this game has. A man does not have a frivolous orgasm, only ejaculates, and not for any kind of sexual gratification, but rather as a demonstration of masculine dominance and/or virility. It is sex not understood on any level beyond the cold mechanical, culturally symbolic, and of course, edgily offensive. While there is a whole page of completely useless rules for determining ejaculation distance and vaginal soreness, things like arousal are not even alluded to outside of a few magic effects and items. Things like a cloak that makes a character attempt to orally tantalize their own genitals, which incidentally is the only time a clitoris is mentioned in a sexual context. You do not want to know what the other contexts are. Which is really unfortunate because I would absolutely love to see the vaginal tenting adjustment table. I'm just kidding, I am positive he does not know that's a thing. But more importantly, as weird and joyless as these rules are, they are also terrible, like mechanically terrible. Adding the average of up to 7 values to your roll is absolutely nonsensical. If it was always 7 values, or the values were not averaged, it would at least be coherent and predictable, but as it is, adding a modifier does not guarantee a bonus in any way. Like from the example, we started with a modifier of 4.2. Adding 2 points from positions knocked that down to 3.83. Then the weird 2-to-1 attribute adjustment brought it up to 7.77. And if we did happen to have 1 ranking contortion, adding that would drop the modifier down to 6.81. To actually increase the applied modifier would require at least 10 ranks. But if we really wanted to get that bonus up, we could have just taken the game's advice and put a sack over her head, completely removing the largest negative and upping the total modifier to 11.4. But if we're going to do that, might as well just cut the lights out entirely and remove all of the ability modifiers, which would drop the modifier to 11, but then if we decided not to use those 2 points from positions, we would increase the modifier to 15.5. Basically, this one rule has the potential for the stupidest min-maxing ever. Unless I have completely got the rules wrong, but roll 3d10 and apply the average of all relevant modifiers is the only explanation provided, and any alternative interpretation I can come up with that does make more sense mechanically also does not fit the very limited instructions that are given. And from there, I could spend a lot of time questioning things like if only the active partner is supposed to roll during oral sex, or if you apply orgasm rules during anal, or even better, how to handle a male receiving partner since ejaculation is automatic, or how you can apply these rules to something like BDSM. But the fact is, there just aren't answers to those questions. I could give you my interpretation of how these rules could potentially be modified for all manner of sex acts, but the fact is that complete rules for anything outside of the most vanilla penis and vagina sex just don't exist. And even the rules provided for that are incomplete, and I had to guess on how to implement some of them. So the best I could ever hope to do is make guesses at what might have been the intentions, if there were ever intentions at all. And that is basically it for my discussion on the sex rules in Fatal, and I think you can understand why not only did I not cover them originally, but also took 2 years to get around to it. And while there are many, many questions here, I think the big one is why. Why do these rules even exist? What purpose are they supposed to serve in a game? And I'm pretty sure the answer is none. They are not sexually gratifying, they are not amusing, they do not meaningfully contribute to the game in any narrative or mechanical way. And yet, sexual adeptness, for some reason, is the second most thoroughly detailed skill in the game after wrestling. So why is this more or less useless skill so incredibly complex, especially considering that it was fairly simple in the previous version, and that most of the rules added don't actually affect the outcome of the skill check? Well, as someone with something of a unique perspective on this from having covered this game so much, having been on the 2000s internet and dealt with lots of this particular kind of guy, and also being a self-identified sexual degenerate, I think I actually have a pretty good idea what function these rules are supposed to serve, and why people don't want to understand that. Because the somewhat disappointing answer here is that all of the sexual content in Fatal is for shock value. And I feel like a lot of people can't recognize that because when you have a sex-negative perspective, you can't imagine sexual content existing for any reason other than sexual gratification. But Fatal is not some salaciously horny game made by a depraved pervert. It is a game that is trying to be offensive, made by someone who thinks that sex is offensive. Like, keep in mind that we are talking about a game which asserts that heterosexual anal sex is less common than bestiality, requires a woman to have a debauchery score of 61 out of 100 to be willing to receive oral sex, and a weird obsession with gay men that conveniently stops short of ever actually mentioning gay sex as anything other than a punchline. Byron Hall's views on sex are probably closer to the people he was trying to offend than anyone who's ever actually done anything above 50 on the debauchery table, which really does seem to be his line between acceptable and deviant sex acts. There is no author's fetish on display here, well, other than possibly all the sexual assault and cannibalism, but analyzing that would be an entire hour video on its own. The fact is, Fatal is not horny. It is probably one of the least horny role-playing games I have ever seen, because even in games with no sexual content and no mention of sex at all, the horniness still comes through in other areas. But Fatal is trying so hard to be both offensive and intellectual that everything feels hollow and forced, and the sex rules in particular feel like they were written by someone who barely understands sex on anything other than the most basic mechanical level for the express purpose of shocking some hypothetical pearl-clutching grandma. And that was the amount of talking I want to do on the topic of the sex rules in Fatal. Not sexy, not funny, and mechanically inconsistent at best. Which would actually be a much better tagline for the game as a whole. And will I do even more Fatal videos in the future? I don't know, maybe. This game is an incredible pain to deal with, but also, whenever I open this book, I keep finding things that are interesting, but I haven't even touched on yet. Like spellcasting and the game mastering section with a sample adventure, the differences between the adult lechery and Another Land versions, or, like the fact that for some reason there is a section of recipes. There's a lot of stuff in this game that is dumb, and I could talk about, and might. And thank you for watching. If you enjoy the wacky things I say and do, you can follow me on Blue Sky and or Tumblr. You can also join me live on Twitch, where sometimes things get a little weird. And extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails, Broken Unicorn, D-Stex, Diablade, Nikolai Snowtail, Plaid Mouse, Puggo, Randy Maholland, Renee D, Stephen Kramer, Tila Glar, Toshirokuro, and Tyro the Fox. If you want to be cool like them, check out my Patreon or YouTube channel memberships. Two different things that provide similar but distinct benefits. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos that have mysteriously manifested from the ethers, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.